this mechanical voice here. And okay, just okay, here we are. I think we are all set. And well, I already gave this normal 5 minutes space for everyone to join us. And this said, I welcome you to the afternoon panel of this last day of the conference. It had been very different every day. Every part of the presentations, so today, this beginning of the afternoon, we'll have Ana Rodrigues from Canada, I think, and Helena Santana, and Ilaria Lombardo in this first panel. We have these spaces between presentations, so it's 3 presentations during one slot of 1 hour, so we have time, and even in the end, to make questions and answers. So I will invite Ana to share with us her contents. So it's challenging media, misrepresentations of Indigenous women and girls through public art interventions. It's yours.
Thank you, Pedro. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm gonna share my screen.
Yes.
Let me know if you can't see it. Okay. Gallery has just gone over here to the side, so you may see me looking to the side because of my camera, but okay. Good morning, actually good afternoon, everyone. It's morning here in Canada. So as Pedro was saying, he just had lunch, I just had breakfast. My name's Ana Rodrigues, Ana Rodrigues. My family is from Lisbon, Portugal, but they immigrated to Canada a number of years ago. That's where I've been living. Pedro, thank you for introducing my presentation. Let's go to the next slide. Just a little bit about me. So I teach in the faculty, currently Faculty of Education at Ontario Tech University. And that university is located in Oshawa in Canada. Oshawa is about 50 kilometers east of Toronto. It's a small town. So my doctoral research looked at street art through an educational lens because my PhD is in education. So all the work that I do in terms of looking at public art is always through an educational lens. I've adopted the terms public art interventions to describe the type of artifacts that I'm now looking at, because I feel that I'm looking at so much more than just street art. So I include rock art, murals, street art, posters, performance, public displays, all part of the different types of public artifacts that I look at that are sometimes created legally or illegally. And as well, I look at these public art interventions as a form of public pedagogy. And so this is a framework I've been working with since the time that I was looking at street art through an educational lens. Public pedagogy is a theory used in education that looks at how we learn outside of institutions such as universities and schools, so formal learning. So I like to look at public art interventions and try and figure out how we can learn from them, but in an informal manner in different communities. Because I'm going to be talking about public art interventions that have been created by Indigenous peoples in Canada, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So the Indigenous peoples in Canada are the original inhabitants of this area that we now live in. And it's a government term, Indigenous. I will be using the word Indian in this presentation, and I'm going to be using it as a government term, but that's not a term that is appropriate. But as I said, I'm using it because there's still policies that use that word. So right now, what the government has done has divided the original inhabitants into 3 groups or categories. So First Nations, which is the largest Indigenous group in Canada, and typically, and First Nations were people that originally were living south of the Arctic Circle. The Inuit, northern regions of Canada, the people that populated those areas, and then the Métis are a mixed descendant of both European and First Nations, mostly French. So the first French settlers and First Nations. And so when I'm saying they were living in these areas, it doesn't mean that they live still in these areas. Everyone lives all over Canada now, but it's just to kind of sort of identify the different groups. But I also wanted to point out that, for example, in the First Nations Indigenous group, there are many people that speak different languages, there are different cultural traditions. So it's, unfortunately, when we say the word Indigenous, it seems like everybody is the same, everyone speaks the same language, everyone has the same cultural traditions, and that is not true. It'd be like the same thing of saying, where are you from? And a person says, I'm from Europe. And therefore everyone in Europe speaks the same language. So we know that's not true. So I tried to not say Indigenous, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will refer to Indigenous peoples when needed, but just keep that in mind. So there have been several government policies throughout decades, centuries, put in place by successive governments and in terms of colonialism as well that happened over the centuries that have attempted to destroy and assimilate Indigenous peoples in Canada. So for example, land displacement, forcibly removing people from their ancestral lands and moving them into reserve systems, residential schools, removing children from their families to go into schools that were mostly run by the Catholic order and the government here in Canada. The Indian Act, which I'll talk a little bit more because it affected First Nations women, the impact was quite deep. The Indian Act is still enacted. It still is in place in Canada today. The 60s scoop, where in the 1950s and 60s, children were forcibly removed from their family homes. Their mothers were deemed unfit, and those children were then adopted out to non-Indigenous families, sometimes outside of the country. Starvation policies, and so on. There are many more policies. These are just a few. Indigenous women have been extremely impacted by these policies, and I'm going to talk about the Indian Act, which I talked about in the previous slide. It was enacted in 1876, and it only applies to First Nations. So that is the largest group, as I indicated in the previous slide, of Indigenous peoples in Canada. It does not apply to the Métis or the Inuit. So this act, which is still in place, had many, many different sort of parts to it that impacted women quite deeply over the years, First Nations women. So one is that, for example, they could not hold official positions of power in their communities. So women were no longer allowed to be chiefs, and this was allowed before the act was enacted. The other piece is not being allowed to own property or land on the reserve after they were moved from their ancestral lands and moved to a reserve system. They were then not allowed to own property or land until their husband died. So essentially they are economically without any power until their husband dies and they are a widow. So various amendments have been made to the Act over the years to make it less discriminatory. And it's not because the government has been kind and has decided to change it, but rather women have, and men as well, but mostly women have gone to the courts, through the court system to make changes. There was another piece of the Indian Act that was really affected First Nations women, was that if they married a man that was not considered to be First Nations, and it had to be outlined the way the government said a person is First Nations, they would lose their status. And when they lost their status, it meant that they had to leave the reserve, which meant that they would leave all their family. They would have to leave whatever, whatever was going on there that they needed, any benefits they might have, they would lose that. But on the other hand, if a man married a woman who was not First Nations, he would not lose his status. So in 1985, a woman went, it took a long time, but there were lots of different challenges and that was changed. But as you can see, from 1876 to 1985, there are all sorts of women who are losing their status, and obviously decades that impacted families and women over the years. So when Kim Anderson, I've pulled this quote from a book that she's written. She is an Indigenous writer and scholar. She writes that the first Europeans who arrived in Canada were really shocked to see the position of Indigenous women in their communities, because this was very different from their values that they were bringing from Europe. So they viewed women as property without agency or rights, and they arrive in Canada and they see that women have high positions of power, whether they are running the communities or whether they are doing it, you know, behind, kind of not in front, but behind, you know, making decisions. They had a lot of respect and influence. And in fact, Indigenous communities were matriarchal, and they are returning to that, and they were not patriarchal. So of course, as you can see, there's this clash of values when the colonialists arrive. And so they figured out very quickly that if they wanted to dominate the land, they needed to disempower women and to change that system. And that is what they set out to do with these various policies. There was a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in 2019 in Canada. And you may say, well, why would there be a national inquiry? Why is there such a need? Well, in fact, there are so many missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada that the United Nations Human Rights Office has deemed it an epidemic. It's not only in Canada, it's also in the United States, but I'm just talking about the situation in Canada right now. So research has shown that an Indigenous woman or girl is 5 times more likely to be murdered than a non-Indigenous woman or girl in Canada currently. So this national inquiry took up a whole section, and they brought in experts and they talked to many, many people. It was an inquiry that took months. And out of it came 2 volumes of over 700 pages each. And one section was devoted to looking at Canadian mass media. And so they said what was written in as part of one of the volumes was that in the absence of appropriate representations of Indigenous people in the media means that misrepresentations become the accepted truth. And so since 1975, but even before then, but some prominent research happened in 1975, and even up to a couple of years ago, there's been a lot of research looking at how current and past negative representations of Indigenous women and girls in Canadian media contribute to these stereotypes that still exist. So they have made direct connections between the violence that that Indigenous women and girls are experiencing in Canada currently and these negative representations. So some of these stereotypes, and they do show up still, like in news stories, in media, film, is that Indigenous women are uneducated. Indigenous women are unfit mothers. Indigenous women are criminals. They're submissive. The other side of the coin is that they're submissive without agency and disempowered. And you can see how policies that have been put in place for decades have allowed these stereotypes to happen and then to perpetuate and continue in society. So I've been looking at, as I said, public art interventions for a number of years through my research. And I've documented through photography these public art interventions for at least maybe 9 years now. And I started to look at pictures that I had taken even 8 and 9 years ago. And I started to see that pieces that were created by Indigenous artists who are women actually contained a lot of narratives of empowerment, resilience, and agency that were in stark contrast with these misrepresentations that we find in Canadian mass media. And so I started to look more closely at these images and go through all of the images I have taken to pull these out and start to analyze them more carefully. And I also started to see what sort of information is being provided on Indigenous culture and traditions as part of these pieces. And so my analysis, and right now I've pulled about 10, and I'm going to continue to do analysis. But what I wanted to analyze in each of these pieces were elements that first counteract those misrepresentations that I talked about. So the uneducated Indigenous woman, the unfit mother, the woman who's disempowered, those sorts of stereotypes that we're seeing, and also look for elements that are educational as part of the piece. And my analysis so far, as I said, it continues, but it seems to support that these pieces work as forms of public pedagogy. So not only are they changing the viewpoints of those who may encounter the pieces because they're providing an alternative narrative that you don't see in mass media, but they also provide pieces of information on Indigenous culture and traditions. So I'm just going to show you 3 quick examples. This is a stencil that I took an image of in July of 2015 in Montreal. And this to me is an example of agency and empowerment that opposes the stereotype of the Indigenous woman who's seen with weak and without agency. So this is a stencil of Chief Teresa Spence, who is the former chief of Attawapiskat First Nation. She came into prominence in Canada. She became very well known because she went to the official federal government off Parliament Hill in Ottawa and staged a 6-week hunger strike to bring awareness to various issues on her First Nations and other First Nations. And that is lack of housing, education, lack of proper food, suicide rates. There are children as young as the age of 10 who have died by suicide and have, and this continues. And this is something that she was bringing attention to, that this is obviously something that needs to be looked at by the government. So she was, as I said, she was brought into prominence because of her hunger strike, but as well, some images were taken of her. And there is one where she's shown with a headdress. Now, she, being a chief, as I said, was not allowed under the Indian Act for a number of years for women. And so seeing a woman in a headdress was not seen a lot. And it doesn't mean that every chief receives a headdress. A headdress is a spiritual thing. It is a thing that the community decides to give to someone who has done a lot of good, that the community comes together and decides this person deserves a headdress because they have done a lot of things for the betterment of the community. But as I said, because a lot of women weren't in positions of power, they were not receiving these headdresses. She's received one, and a picture was taken of her with it. And this is the image that was stenciled by Wall of Femmes, who's a collective of artists in Montreal. And I feel that this is very important to show her in a headdress because it shows her with something that is usually associated with men. So again, it opposes that stereotype of the disempowered Indigenous woman. This mural by Monique Aura and Chief Lady Bird, who are both artists, Indigenous artists, First Nations artists, they're both Anishinaabe, that provides an alternative narrative on Indigenous mothering. So there's several nurturing and care themes that can be seen in this mural, and that opposes that stereotype of the unfit mother that was used to remove children from their families, you know, to put them in residential schools and also to remove them to put them up for adoption. That was used over and over again. So I want, in terms of Indigenous cultural traditions, you see the child in the cradle board. So that is a mobile cradle that is an Indigenous device that is used to take care of very young children, and mothers can go to work and go do the things that they need to do while their child is near them. And the cradle board was something that became was not used anymore because it was discouraged. So for example, missionaries said that the cradle board was not good for infant children, and therefore it began to be discouraged. So it wasn't outright banned because there were ceremonies and traditions that were banned by several policies, but it was discouraged. And so the cradle board was not something that Indigenous families were using. It has now come back into prominence. But the cradle board is created by people in the family, specifically when they're awaiting the child to arrive. It has a lot of spiritual meaning to it. And so all of that is embedded into this sort of tradition. So that is very prominent, along with the strawberry that is on the chest of the woman in the mural. And the strawberry is connected to Indigenous teachings on womanhood, mothering, and kinship. And this is a very special time in June when the strawberry arrives, and there's many different ceremonies that are part of this. So again, this mural provides that alternative narrative and some pieces of information on Indigenous culture as well. And one last example is this mural created by Natalie King, who is also a First Nations artist, Anishinaabe. And in this mural, she highlights family systems in Indigenous culture, so kinship. She actually wrote on her Instagram that the mural speaks to her love, adoration, and appreciation of all the amazing matriarchal figures in her life. Collective experience as community informs my identity. And so the Indigenous family system was one that was not understood by Westerners and was looked upon as not being appropriate. So it's a community sort of perspective on raising a child. So a child will not only be raised by their mother, but perhaps by aunts and by family, extended family, and also by friends, and the whole community takes a part. So this was very different from the Western viewpoint of raising a child, which tends to be the mother, the father. It's sort of contained within the family. So what she's highlighting is this family system that was also used as a way to say, let's remove children from their families because their system is not appropriate. So this again, the mural brings back, highlights the family system, shows mothering in a different alternative way that we're not used to seeing, but also highlights the importance of kinship. So that's it for my presentation. I'm sorry if I spoke really quickly.
No, it was great.
Okay, thank you. And there's my contact information if anybody wants any information.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. And,
thank you for the opportunity.
For bringing us this specific local topic. I don't know if anyone wants to give voice to some question or comment at this point. If not, they can also write in the chat and use the chat for changing contacts or further information with Anna. Okay? Okay, so we will move forward, Anna, just to keep up the time. And I ask, so I think they are sisters, Helena and Maria?
Sim. Sim.
Boa. You'll be done doing the presentation in English, yes?
Nós tínhamos planeado em português.
Ok. Podemos fazer uma espécie de tradução, porque a maior parte das pessoas...
Okay.
Eu posso tentar acompanhar e fazer.
Ok. Nós podemos tentar ver o que é que pode sair. Ok?
Ok. Boa. Thank you. Obrigado.
Ops. Compartilhamento. Now it's good. So we talk about how street art can honor culture and their artists, and we focus in Fado. Fado it's a very important language, musical language in Portugal, because we have different artists, and it is proposed in some local. In some spaces in Lisbon and other cities, and Fado have several important elements, like artists, like musical elements, like instruments, like themes that can be approached in letters and form. So, and street art can really relieve these elements and the artists that made Fado, namely Amália Rodrigues and others artists. Street art have several elements. We see links from Bordalo 2 that we can see in Lisbon, and we can also speak about Fado. We have several influence in street in the way we can show the different elements of Fado. In this image, we have Amália and we have the guitarra portuguesa, the instrument, the most important instrument in Fado. We can show the the artists and the instruments, but also the streets and the locals that are specific to do this intervention, is musical intervention. The urban space is also important because the urban space can inform the sound that we hear. The urban space is also important because the things we saw in these streets and the buildings, the people, the things, the elements that we see can be pushed to the musical intervention and the moral intervention, like we saw in this image too. The street art can push our attention to several things. We can push to cultural elements, to ambiental elements, to political elements, to memorialist elements, and we can speak about fado. We have a mural that is conceived by Nuno Saraiva in 2013, is Fado Vadio in Moraria, local in Lisbon. Several elements are put in this mural, like the priest, the singers, the instruments, and so on. We have Severa in represented Severa, Fernando Mauricio, and Father Edgar, that are people that lives in the Moraria and have an important role in Fado. Fado is also represented in Museu do Fado, Museum of Fado. In Brazil, we can saw a dance that they play Fado. The first reference to Fado is an expression, an artistic expression in not destiny. We have, today, we speak about destiny, we speak about saudade in Fado, but it's not the first speak about this two elements. So Museu do Fado is important, but it's important also Ferreirinha and the cafes and the restaurants in Lisbon, and Alfada, Moraria, and others neighbors. In this, those spaces, the fado was singing, and the several elements are spoken. They speak about saudade, love, and several their life is. Continua tu, Rosário.
So we can say that Fado is born in Lisbon. Important to speak about this kind of themes that are very important in their life in Lisbon. We can see this in several locals in Lisbon. So in this slide, we can see an event of Fado near the urban elements that you can that we have seen in other slides. You can put. It is important also to say that this kind of urban elements speak about the ancient regime in Portugal and speak about the crisis that we live in there. Also about the importance of being a singer of Fado and the need that they have to have a professional card to exerce their profession. You can go on. So in this kind of regime, we don't have the right to speak about several themes, and we don't have the liberty to speak about things. And Fado was an important way to speak about them, because at the letters and at the music, we can say things that we can't speak freely in the streets. So it is very important to speak about this kind of manifestation, art manifestation, and how is important to us to speak and show in the streets, because he goes from the streets to the inside of the houses of Fado, and it's this way of thinking that gives Fado the importance that he has today.
You are muted, Helena. Ok. Boa. Estás agora sim.
Rosário, é que tu continua a falar. Eu agora perdi se estou ou não ativa.
Está ativa, está ativa.
Here a little problem with informatics. So Amalia Rodrigues is important because she begins to speak and to sing erudite poetry, and she took poetry to another level that comes outside the houses of Fado to all the people that hear Fado and hear this kind of manifestation. So it's our point of view about this. It's our point of view how to show Fado is important to show the culture of Portuguese, not only in Lisbon, like this kind of manifestation from Vils, that is the portrait of Amalia in Lisbon, but also others kind of manifestations like this. You can see here a mural that took place in the wall of the building, very, very interesting to us, because give us not only the face, but all the body of Amalia. Here we have also the two important artists of Fado, Paredes and José Afonso. So you can see the different manifestations of urban creativity and urban manifestations of art in some different places in Lisbon. Here also Amalia and another kind of manifestation that is the José Malhoa, an important interpreter of Fado in Lisbon. So I don't have nothing more to say to you, only that the Fado is present in this kind of manifestations, not only with the instruments that give us the sonority, the music, that is very important. The Portuguese guitar that is present in the slide that you can see, and also the way of seeing the Fado Badio, the manifestation that we speak, with a present interpreter that is the Alema. You can put a little of this.
Tudo que eu tenho é uma caneta e o pôr do sol desenhado no canto de um papel amarrotado pelo meu ódio. Acredito em pesadelos belos quando a vida dá-me estalos com luvas de ferro, mano. Queimo o tempo como nicotina acesa ao vento. Por poemas para amigos, empatia vou colhendo. Dilema coletivo na tempestade, o meu abrigo. Procuro o teu porque nem o céu é o limite. Carrego o meu orgulho como um amuleto ao peito, sujeito a ser comido por este mundo imperfeito. Respiro música fria como uma rua escura. Necessita a vossa ajuda, temos que pegar a lua. Prefiro inimigos do que falsos amigos. Isto é o fado de um poeta, vá do bolso. Vou compreendendo que a máquina que move a vida é o sentimento.
Desde os blocos de cimento às salas de julgamento, 90% de nós acabam por ir dentro. Acredita em mim, mano, a reputação é fachada perante os obstáculos diários nesta longa caminhada. Num dia temos tudo, no outro não temos nada. Bem ou mal, nunca percas o equilíbrio, há que ser racional. Porque o amor é um passo do ódio nas situações extremas. Tens de ser frio para resolver problemas. Porque quem tem tudo vive por trás de um escudo, mas quem não tem nada vive pela lei da espada. A sentença é pesada, mas encara de frente quem tem vergonha do que sente.
All considerations you can see Moraria, in Moraria Fado Vadio. We have heard Fado Vadio from Dialema. It's an unusual way to speak about Fado, but the elements that Fado uses in the traditional way are in the Dialema proposal, because they talk about things from life, from love, from the life, the things that we capture from the streets and from the way we live in streets. So we have these elements. We have the moral elements that represent several figures that are important in this kind of music. We have the themes. We have the importance that these moral elements can capture in the way the tourist looks these elements, the buildings, the streets, and all that we can capture in the streets of Lisbon. The Fado is not only the music. Fado is a way of thinking, a way of living, a way of stay in the city. Fado is also saudade. Fado is also sensualism. Fado is the human perception of the local, they live the streets, but also the cities and the several things that we can capture in these spaces. Morals in Lisbon are from figures of the Fado, Amália, Carlos Paredes, Zeca Afonso, and several artists. But it's important to look, because Fado is an important way to express our culture and express the cultures and emphasize artists. We can see in the murals and we can saw in figures of the way we can illustrate Camões and Dali, for example. So it's important, it's good to see these things, because we can express ourselves and show our culture. And we want to say that mine is not good. I'm not prepared to do this thing in English, sorry.
No problem, sem problemas. Obrigado, Helena e Maria. I need to say that from reading the slides, the contents and the amount of information, it's really vast and very relevant. I think you really need to move with this research that you are developing, and it's very, very interesting what you are doing on this parallel. This is my personal thinking, and hopefully there will be more opportunities to share it with a more preparation of the English for the broader audience. Thank you so much for your participation. I don't know if is there some direct comment or question. Esther, please.
Hi, thank you, Helena, Maria, and Anna, for your presentations. And it appears to me that between these two representations, and there was like in Fado representations, it was more reachable for the public or for tourists than maybe these murals that represent indigenous women. So I was wondering if there was some kind of tour that takes these murals that Anna has presented to make people get to know these issues and these values that are hidden. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Esther.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a tour right now just specific to Indigenous murals in Toronto or in Montreal. So there are tours of graffiti and street art, but it's not specific, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking that it would be interesting.
Yes, for sure. I just need to add also a comment before we can move on. We are tight on time. Actually, Fado have this thing that both it was a way of passing informations that were prohibited under the radar, but at the same time, it was an accepted form of culture in the dictatorship time. So it was ambivalent at that time. And I think it's kind of interesting because at the same time, the same things are happening with graffiti also. We have ambivalent things going on. You have the big murals that are, supported by the city municipalities and so on, and you have the anti-graffiti that still goes on. So, and sometimes subliminal messages are passing across between these worlds. So it's this aspect. I think it was in my mind and I needed to share. Sorry. So thank you both for the presentations. I now invite the next presenter, Ilaria Lombardo. Ilaria.
Hi everyone.
Hello, thank you.
Inviting me to this very stimulating conference. I will share my screen, hopefully.
Yes, please.
Yes, can you see
it?
Okay,
yes, it's all good. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, all set. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ilaria Lombardo, and I'm doing my PhD at Goldsmiths, University of London, in the Department of Media Communications and Cultural Studies. My PhD research explores the role of art as a decolonizing method in Palestinian refugee camps. And specifically, I focus on the Dheisheh camp, which is in the West Bank. In my PhD, I explore various artistic forms in the Dheisheh camp, from post-colonial, subaltern, and decolonial perspective. But today I'm going to focus only on graffiti. And specifically, I will explore the interactions between visual art and space in order to hopefully demonstrate how the very particular space of the Palestinian refugee camp can introduce and propose alternative meanings of graffiti from a non-Western perspective. I will focus on the intersections between art, space, and politics. in the refugee camp that has a different essence compared to the space of the city or the space of the exhibition. In fact, I claim that art is embedded in the camp, in the space of the camp, and in the everyday life of refugees. Art, in fact, is part of the collective memory, and it is also it also generates counter narratives. Today, I will show you some of the graffiti that I photographed in Dheisheh in 2014, like this one on the screen. When I entered the camp, the first thing that caught my attention was the constant presence of graffiti on the walls of the camp. Also, I had the opportunity to discuss a few graffiti with some of the people who worked on them. And today I'm going to share with you my research that builds upon the conversations that I had in the camp, but also the political understandings of art and space of the Dheisheh refugees and the existing literature on space, visual art, and refugee camps. So, next slide. Yeah. So first I would like to provide a brief overview of the Dheisheh camp, which is located in the Bethlehem urban area in the West Bank. So in the first image, you can see where the city of Bethlehem is located in the center south of the West Bank. And in the second image, you can see the Dheisheh refugee camp, which is located in the south of Bethlehem. The Dheisheh camp was established in 1949, 1 year after the Nakba, the foundation of Israel, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The camp is managed by UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. And today is one of the biggest and most densely populated camps in the West Bank. In fact, it hosts over 15,000 refugees who live in less than a half square meter. But this is according to UNRWA, but actually the space of the camp has been expanding over the years. The camp, as all the Palestinian refugee camps, was meant to be a temporary solution, but actually it has been in place for over 72 years. When it was established, the Dheisheh camp was made of tents, as you can see in the first image. And it originally hosted around 3,000 refugees coming from 45 villages around Jerusalem and Hebron. According to UNRWA regulations, refugees can reside in the camp, but they cannot build, sell, rent, or transfer properties. However, the Dheisheh refugees started building houses and actually illegally building the space of the camp that today looks more like the second image. So the houses and lands of the Dheisheh are not legally owned by anyone because private or public property does not legally exist in the camp. So this particular space, which is neither public nor private, it is totally different, of course, from the space of the city. And the space of the camp has been defined by the Dheisheh refugees as a common space. The notion of common has been discussed in the context of a project which is called Campus in Camps. This project has been conducted by DAR, Decolonizing Architecture Art Research, in the Dheisheh camp. And the participants to the project worked collectively to redefine some key terms such as common, knowledge, citizenship, ownership, etc. And they did this by offering their own perspectives, their own experiences of these notions. So this project has been fundamental for my research because it really helped me understand the camp space and artistic production from the perspective of its inhabitants. So here you can see the covers of some of the Campus in Camps booklets. Ownership, Aysara Saifi from the Dheisheh camp explains the significance of graffiti in the space of the camp. And he writes, for us and for the other inhabitants of the camp, the walls are neither public nor private property. Many people consider them common. The paintings tell our stories of refugeehood and daily life to visitors of the camp. They are part of a process of communal participation, creating collective emotions with a greater value than that of the applied material. This is how the meaning of ownership is interpreted in the camp. So the walls and the material space of the camp are a form of common that is activated every day by the Dheisheh refugees in many different ways. And one of these ways is the production of graffiti on the walls of the camp. Also, the process of painting graffiti in the Dheisheh is itself a collective process. In fact, the production of graffiti is described by the Dheisheh refugees as a social event where everyone participates in different ways. And this is also because graffiti in the camp are the product of collective memory and the product of the shared experience of the everyday life in the camp. So the counter narratives emerging from the graffiti belong to everyone. Also, anyone can paint, can see, delete, modify graffiti. And in this perspective, graffiti are a deeply political form in Rancière terms, you know, since the distinction between artist and spectator vanishes. Also in the camp, graffiti, from this perspective, if we assume this perspective, we understand that graffiti are not understood as artworks. They have to be temporary. That's because the walls and the camp itself can be destroyed at any time, or at best, refugees can leave the camp and return to Palestine, to their original homeland. So as written in one of the Campus in Camps booklets, the camp is not a museum. So you can see in this image that graffiti are part of the everyday life and space of the camp. In fact, graffiti in the camp have a political function. They're not art objects. They are blended in with the space of the camp, which is both a physical and a conceptual space. So the camp is conceptually the space of collective memory, and it is also a space where to develop political imaginaries and claims. But why it is so important to stress the temporariness of the space of the camp? That's because Palestinian refugees live in a temporal limbo, waiting to return to Palestine. On the screen here, you can see a graffito that depicts the UNRWA registration card. And on top, in Arabic, you can read the question, until when? So this UNRWA registration card, ID card, basically doesn't provide refugees with any rights. In fact, refugees need a special permit to travel that it isn't always granted. And also the Dheisheh refugees don't vote, they don't pay taxes, they receive water and electric energy for free from the municipality of Bethlehem. So basically they don't practice traditional citizenship, but they created their own political and social structures that have been developed in the last 73 years of displacement. So over 7 decades of refugeehood, that's a long time. So this means that at least 3 generations probably more, were born in the camp. So they have never seen the places where their families come from. Even so, the collective memory of Palestine and the refugees' counter-narratives have been transmitted throughout generations. And this happened through oral history, but also through artistic practices. So this is why the presence of graffiti is fundamental in the space of the camp, as a way both to remember and to create a political and social fabric that is independent from traditional Western understandings of citizenship, space, and art. So in this graffiti, for example, we can see the relation between space, time, and politics. Now we will help you navigate the image. On top, you can see the key, which is one of the symbols of the right to return. On the left and right side, there are the names of the villages where the Dheisheh refugees come from. And at the center, there is the UN General Assembly resolution of 1948 that, at least in theory, grants the Palestinian right to return. So the resolution reads, the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. This was in 1948. And compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss or damage to property, which under principles of international law or inequity should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible, which in this case is Israel, that does not recognize the Palestinian right to return. So here we can...
Just to conclude, we have like 1 or 2 minutes to conclude. Okay, Ilaria?
Sure, I will make it. So here we can see the link between the past space of the historical Palestine before 1948. So the name of the villages, the present space of the camp that in light of the right to return is a temporary space, and the future of the return. So looking at this graffito, the Dheisheh inhabitants are reminded that the space of the camp is precarious, is temporary, and that the return is awaiting. So in this perspective, the graffito reinforces the perception of precariousness, temporariness, and it also unites refugees in a common political space. So a similar function is performed by the character of Handala that you can see in these images. Handala is this child created by the Palestinian cartoonist Najal Ali, who describes this character as a refugee child who will turn around only when Palestine will be free. So as a symbol of the refugee condition, Handala is very present on the Dheisheh walls, and he interacts with the space. The space of the camp is behind him, and Palestine is in front of Handala, and also in front of all the inhabitants of the camp that collectively look in the direction of a free Palestine. So in this perspective, the spatial and the political imaginations of the Dheisheh refugees create a space where art and politics are deeply related. So in conclusion, through graffiti, the Dheisheh refugees can propose new meanings and understandings of visual art. And I claim that it is necessary to look at refugee spaces and artistic productions in order to stress the political and social significance of graffiti, not by focusing on the specific artwork or artist, but by emphasizing the collective political power of graffiti. And that's it. Thank you very much. Please, if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Ilaria.
Thank you.
Please, all of you, if there's some direct question to Ilaria at this point, I think could be interesting. we do not have much more time, but we can have one good question or two short ones if someone wants to use the time for that. If not, I will tell you for using the chat also and to develop from there.
Also, I left my email address on the slide,
Yes,
so if anyone has questions, can contact me.
Here's a question from Esther Garrido. Was this character originally supposed to be taken by people as a symbol?
The child Hamdallah?
Yeah, I think so.
It is very much in the political and artistic imaginations of Palestinians. It's a very common symbol for Palestinians. I don't think that it was totally meant to become what's become today, but yeah, for sure it is intentionally a symbol of refugeehood. Yeah, Najal Ali was he lived his life, his whole life in exile, and this character was explicitly a refugee child who was who will never grow up until Palestine is free.
Okay, so I think we need to move on because we are already 5 minutes over our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for the rest of the panelists and everyone around. And without further ado, I will pass on to Jacob that he will moderate a short panel with Vittorio Parisi and Kristin Lee-Moss. Jacob,
yes,
you can take it. Yes.
Thank you. And as you said, without further ado, and we are a little bit over time, but we are also only 2 presenters in this panel, so I think we will perhaps catch up. I mean, the first presenter is Vittorio Parisi, who works as Director of Studies and Research at the Villa Arson School of Visual Art in Nice, and he has a PhD in aesthetics from the University of Paris Sorbonne. Is that the correct name? But it's and you have presented before on this conference, but so several of you probably already know that his research activity focuses on the relationship between art and urban non-places, as well as the relationship between street art and the institutional art world, as well as the cultural industry. And this paper that he's presenting today aims to revisit the history of Italian street art by focusing on and questioning 2 peculiar aspects in the light of British theorist Mark Fisher's concept of weird, which was also actually one of my favorite graffiti writers from Stockholm in the 1980s, but that's another issue. But welcome, Vittorio.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for your introduction, and thank you very much to Pedro and all the organizers of the Urban Creativity Conference and this edition. It's a pleasure to meet you again and meet everyone else today. So I start by sharing my screen. So where is it? So you should see my first slide, I guess. Is it okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. So I can start. So yes, as Jacob said, the aim of this paper, the main aim of this presentation, which is an ongoing project that I started really recently, and that I hope I can further develop into a proper article in the following months. The idea is to revisit the history of Italian street art, but perhaps I will extend this also to other non-Italian street artists case studies from its origins to nowadays, and through the lenses of this concept, the concept of the weird, as it has been developed by British theorist and philosopher Mark Fisher. So in fact, the title that I gave to this presentation echoes a well-known essay that Mark Fisher published in 2016, and which, the title of which is The Weird and the Eerie. So I will propose you a couple of quotes by this essay. So the weird and the eerie allow us to see the inside from the perspective of the outside. As we shall see, the weird is that which does not belong. The weird brings to the familiar something which ordinarily lies beyond it. End of quote. And another one, the weird is a particular kind of perturbation. It involves a sensation of wrongness. A weird entity or object is so strange that it makes us feel that it should not exist, or at least it should not exist here. Yet if the entity or object is here, then the categories which we have up until now used to make sense of the world cannot be valid. So this is the concept that has been formulated and developed by Mark Fisher, which makes these distinctions between weird and eerie. Sometimes they can be used as synonyms, but there are some nuances which are very important in Fisher formulation of the two concepts, and why the weird is about something which is present or absent. The eerie is more about the failure of a presence or the failure of an absence. Right now, I will focus on the concept of weird and weirdness. And let's take some steps back, because when we speak about weird, we speak about mostly weird as connected to the arts and to culture. We speak for the most part of a literary phenomenon, of a literary genre, because for instance, authors such as Howard Philip Lovecraft has been published in a pulp, a horror, a science fiction magazine like Weird Tales between the 1920s and the 1950s. The thing is that this weird fiction, which is about science fiction, about horror, about aliens, about all these categories, has always been thought as pure entertainment. But starting in the early 2000s, there has been a whole re-evaluation of this literary phenomenon, of this literary genre, and the idea is that it's not only pure fiction, but such a category of estrangement, of these estranged epistemologies developed by weird literature can actually be used as tools of eco-criticism, of posthumanism and transhumanism. And this is true starting from the early 2000s, when people like Anne and Jeff Vandermeer have read earlier fiction, for instance, by Arthur C. Clarke, by Lovecraft, through the lenses of new critical categories, for instance, environmental criticism, and so on. This is what led Mark Fisher to speak about criticizing the inside from the perspective of the outside. So when, for instance, we read a short story by Arthur C. Clarke, like for instance, Rescue Party from 1946, in which an alien ship travels to Earth in order to rescue what is left of humanity on the occasion of the explosion of the sun. We can read this alien saga as a symbol, as a metaphor of the destruction of Earth, as something connected to current themes like climate change or environmental crisis. So the weird is not only a pure entertainment literature, but it can also be interpreted as a tool for criticism, as a proper political category. So I asked myself this question as when we speak about weird and weirdness and weird fiction, we are mostly speaking about literature, but can we apply the same thoughts, the same reflections, the same thinking to visual arts? And why not trying to apply this to the specific case of street art? And I decided to start to develop this idea by focusing on Italian street art because right now in Italy, there's this whole debate about a weird Italian canon in Italian literature. And so I was thinking, let's take a look to Italian street art and see whether the two categories can be merged, and what comes out by this mix. In a certain sense, I think that when we speak about street art or graffiti, and more precisely about illegal street art and graffiti, we're speaking about a weird phenomenon. Because if we think about what Mark Fisher said, something that does not belong, for instance, we can say that all street art appears, all illegal street art at least, appears in places where art should not belong. I mean, outside museums, outside galleries, outside the white cube, traditional places where we are we are supposed to find art. But when we we explore, for instance, abandoned buildings or interstitial spaces of the city, we also find art, illegal art, unsanctioned art, and this creates a sort of how can you say, a feeling of estrangement, because the impression of the artwork on a surface which is not supposed in theory to host art create a sort of estrangement, of feeling of estrangement. So Italian street art at the end of the 90s and during the whole period of the early 2000s has been developed in places like that, in places like abandoned buildings, squats, interstitial places like wastelands, and so on. And pioneers, street art, Italian street art pioneers like 108 or like Blue or like Microbo, them and Eric Elkane, have all explored this kind of places, but also in the content and the imagery that they have developed through the years, they have approached themes, subjects such as eco-criticism, anti-spatialism, or for instance, posthumanism. So these are the two main categories of weird street art, which I would like to further develop. On the one side, the relationship, the aesthetic relationship between the artworks and these known places, which creates this feeling of estrangement. And on the other side, the main themes and subjects that each artist has explored in their representations and their artworks. So I will start I will focus today on two cases. The case of 108 for the first part, so the part which will be about the relationship between artworks and non-places, and blue in the second part for mostly for the contents of the artwork of the artwork that he usually realizes. I quote an interview that I had with 108 when he speaks about the region, the Italian region of the Po Valley in northern Italy, where he started to develop his abstract shapes. So, I started, the Po Valley is a kind of continuous suburb. What unites the artists of northern Italy is that we all carry within us the experience and memory of these places, for good or for bad. We hang out there even before we went there to paint, when we were children and when we used to ride around the abandoned factories, warehouses and wastelands on our bikes. What struck me most was that they were never really inhabited. They are populated only by outcasts. I think mainly of voyeurs, prostitutes, nomads, outsiders of all kinds, end of quote. And another quote by 108, around 2004, when I realized that for years I had been walking around by myself, making black spots in these uninhabited, ghostly places, I also realized that for me, these places had become a kind of obsession, that I needed to go there to create my shapes. I realized that I too was an outsider and that what I was doing was incomprehensible to most people, not really creating the black spots, but rather creating them in these places. So what I found particularly interesting is that he says like he was sort of pushed to create these black shapes once in these places. And so he created as soon as possible a dialogue between, a sort of dialectic relationship between his art, his practice, and the places he used to explore. And also I was struck by this expression, ghostly places, because the category of the ghostly, of the spectral, is very close to the category of the weird, to the category of the uncanny, of the unfamiliar, and also tells us that these kind of places that we can call interstitial places, as a scholar like Andrea Mubi Brighenti has theorized in the work in the collection of essays he curated in 2013, Urban Interstices, the Aesthetics and Politics of the In-Between. He defines interstices like a space in between others, regarded as somehow minoritarian vis-a-vis other spaces that surround or encircle it, generated as byproducts of urban planning, imagined essentially as vacant lots, terrain vague, or decaying ruins. So the idea of these decaying portions of the city, of these or ghostly spaces, as 108 calls them, makes me think at the figure of the specter, which can describe the ontological status of this kind of places as ontologically suspended between a no longer and a not yet. I mean, a space like a place like a wasteland or an abandoned building usually is something that is no longer something. I mean, a wasteland usually, or what we call a terrain vague, is a place which used to host a former building which has been demolished and which is expecting to be, which we expect that another building should be built on the same site. So this status of ontological suspension produces a total feeling of weirdness, because also it's about presence and absence, like Mark Fisher says in his essay. So on the one side, the relationship between the artworks, the illegal and sanctioned artworks, and non-places produces the feeling of the weird. From the other side, there is also the content of the artworks, which are genuinely weird, because they touches themes that are usually touched by science fiction or horror stories, and this is the very case of an artist like Blue. Quite always in his representations, he uses the categories of, he touches the categories of the alien, of the horror stories, of the transhuman, and but there is something also that strikes me in Blue artistic practice and representations, and that is that Blue interacts a lot with Italian tradition and culture, and also with recently with the Italian Christian Catholic tradition. And I also tell myself that Christian and Catholic tradition is something absolutely weird when we think about the representation of heaven and hell, and it's absolutely about something which is outside, the outside as a category in order to see the inside, and being outside and inside life, outside and inside the earth. And there is precisely this work that he had realized in Rome in 2019, which echoes in some way works like Last Judgment iconography. If we take this image of the Last Judgment by Giotto in the Arena Chapel in Padua, we see that, and we compare it to Blue mural in Re Bibbia in Rome from 2019, we see that the structure is exactly the same. So it's a Last Judgment that he realizes here, but it's an atheist, materialistic Last Judgment, because the figure of the Christ in the mandorla, of the Christ creator in the mandorla, is replaced here by an Italian word, an Italian impersonal verb, which is capita, which means it happens. And so he replaced the Christ with absolute, how can I say, I forgot the word to say caso, to say fate, and we see that people, when people is projected into the world, which is not an extraterrestrial world, but it's not nor an heavenly or a hellish world. It's a terrestrial. It's Earth. People are projected either in a sort of terrestrial hell, which is this kind of anthropocenic puddle, and on the other side, very few are projected into a fancy luxury swimming pool. And the role of the devils or the angels serve on the one side are sort of butlers that serve the rich, the few inside of the swimming pool, and on the other side we have demons in the shape of policemen, which keep quiet the mass into this anthropocenic puddle. And it's exactly the same in a Last Judgment iconography like that of Giotto, in which we have, for instance, the devils that tortures the damned, and on the other side, the angels that escort the blessed in front of the light, in the light of God. So I see in this also in this.
It's like you have to start to reach to the conclusions.
Yes, so. I'm concluding because
perfect.
last slide. So
sorry.
So the conclusion is that my conclusion is that I wish to further develop this line of research, and possibly also to explore weirdness in international street art, and not only on Italian street art, but this is a starting point. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So you see if we have any questions. Thank you for a super interesting presentation. And as Ana Rodrigues, for example, and several, I really enjoy, especially as an art historian, when you go into detail of the actual images and analyze them in detail. I thought this was an interesting, this kind of distinction you make between the weirdness or the unheimlichness or the uncanny of the relationship between the place and the artwork, and on the other hand, the possible weirdness of the images in themselves is kind of interesting. But I was thinking about this, how this is perhaps, especially since you mentioned the unheimlichness or the uncanniness, isn't in a deindustrialized area, graffiti and street art is of course weird in some senses, but isn't it also the other way around? They could very much be a part of making it heimlich, making it familiar, making its place making for young people. So could it be possible to elaborate on this idea of that for some groups it's very clearly weird, and for other groups it's making them not so weird? You understand my question?
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree, because of course I need to distinguish the place and the role of the spectator of graffiti and street art when speaking about weirdness, because there will be, I guess, lots of citizens, of residents, which when put in front of an abandoned warehouse filled with graffiti, they can sense this feeling of uncanniness. And also, I think that in lots of movies, I mean, the representation, the imagery of the abandoned building filled with graffiti is usually used in order to represent threatening spaces and so on. But of course, there are lots of people for whom those kind of places are absolutely interesting and very homely, heimlich, as you told. I mean, for me, is like that. I mean, when I visit these kind of places, I wouldn't say I feel home. I wouldn't use that kind of rhetoric, but I like those places because I'm interested in those places, and so I can have this kind of familiar attachment to this kind of places. But yeah, of course, when I talk about uncanniness of abandoned places and graffiti, I mostly think about people who usually consider those places as threatening places, and also the idea that art belongs to museums, to collections, and if it belongs to the public space, it must be a sort of projection of the white cube into the public space. But when it goes out the circle of the institutional art world, I think it becomes a little bit uncanny for most of spectators.
I think you are onto something, and I also think if you look back to the roots of style writing in Philadelphia and New York, it was also during deindustrialization, and a part of this, the zero tolerance on graffiti especially, was built on the idea that this was something that was in the wrong place and made people feel insecure and unsafe. So that is something that could be Definitely, and I also think that especially the quote from the Po Valley, which reminds me about a story I heard from Scene from the UA in New York, where he said that the 4-yard, which was the train yard, he mainly was a playground for kids when they grew up, because there were no fences, so you could just go in there. So it's definitely as you said, a possibility to link this to outside both Italian street art, but also to a wider, the perspectives could be used for also within the graffiti studies. Is there I'm not going to be the one talking. Is there any other question to Vittorio? Otherwise, perhaps we can, if we can perhaps return to it. But then I would say it's time for this panel's second presenter. Thank you, Vittorio.
Thank you very much.
It's time for me to present Dr. Kristin Moss, who is Associate Professor in Art, Media and Design in the School of Arts at California State University, San Marcos. And Kristin researches visual art, arts administration, communication, and media. And the current research focuses on international women street artists, and her presentation is a critical analysis of street art as a creative tool for social change by women or queer identifying street artists around the globe. And she will also look a little bit into photography and online sharing as a way of connecting local issues to broader public discourses. So let us welcome Dr. Kristin Moss.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, it's morning for me. Nice. I'm very fascinated with your work, Vittorio. Thank you. Excellent presentation. And thanks for that introduction, Jacob. And I think you can see me, but I'm not at the beginning. Okay, well, hopefully, is this full screen now?
Nope.
Okay. Excuse me, I'm so sorry.
No worries. Maybe you can use the small button in the right bottom corner. You have there a small button. Or you can present it like this for us. It's okay.
Okay, I might have to, just because, because of my ignorance. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. The power of paint and paste ups. This is kind of one bit of something that's much larger for me. And I'm choosing just to talk about a few artists that are very well known, but think about maybe what they're doing in their practice a little bit differently. And then also the overall effects, right, of what different types of practices can be. And Jacob explained a little bit about my background and what I look at. A lot of my published work is more on other kinds of public art and murals. I definitely, though, see street art, and that's what I've been focusing on, as really significant in public discourse. I'm interested in its democratic potential and participation in street art as kind of an avenue of social change and an avenue of democratic participation. And I really got interested in this because I'm teaching both classes in public art and in contemporary women artists, but also in art and social change. And so I was really finding again and again many artists who are using socially engaged street art as part of organized programs, you know, of social change. Overall, I do take an approach that's more in line with visual culture, maybe than art history. And the kind of methodological approach that I use was based in a methodology by Barbara Rose called critical visual methodology. And the most important aspect of that for me is kind of imagining that the meaning that's created in work happens in 3 interrelated sites that happen across from all the way pre-production, how something comes to be, the design idea, where it happens, all of these ideas about the production, then analyzing the work specifically itself in the context where it is, and then finally, and this goes on over time, about the different kinds of reception you know, that work receives. So I'm always looking kind of at this 3-part framework whenever I'm considering any kind of public artwork. So let me start with today's work by telling you a story and presenting an artist, something that happened on our campus. In spring 2019 at California State University, San Marcos, we had a meet and greet with the artist Jessica Sabagal to unveil her new murals that were located inside the library. She's based in the San Francisco area, and Sabagal is a queer identified, first generation Colombian American muralist and stencil and spray artist who uses her work as a medium for social change, action, and empowerment. And she became pretty well known when she worked with Shepard Fairey on different street art campaigns during We the People. The murals that she created are located within the central stairwell of the building, and they're large-scale portraits of several students at CSUSM. This photo is of her with several of the participants, and then other student artists also assisted with the process. And each of these students is kind of framed within the architecture and rendered in a minimalist color set that's a signature of the artist. And they're meant to really represent the diversity of the student body. We're in Southern California. We have a very diverse campus. We're majority non-white, and so this is very much a an aspect of our campus culture that we celebrate and talk about a lot. And so even though the color palette kind of unifies the look of the student portraits, the differences in gender, sexuality, ability, and racial, ethnic, cultural background are really highlighted. And the project title is In This Classroom, There Are No Walls. And so for this particular event, about 50 members of the community turned out, and Sabagal was talking about how important it is to create spaces that are inclusive of diversity and invite dialogue. And she invited question and fielded questions from the audience about all these different aspects of her practice. And here's a couple of views of part of the artwork. But during the event, one attendant, who's a white male, raised his hand and he framed his questions really defensively and was really agitated and started yelling things like, "Why do you think it's okay to put political messages on a wall in public place? Why do you get to come in here and make me feel uncomfortable?" So the artist fielded this and other increasingly agitated questions and accusations with a lot of deftness and with grace. As a queer artist and a feminist artist, she's definitely found herself to be under attack, negative attacks at other points. And she just really said that, she hoped her work promoted dialogue, encouraged the young man and the whole audience to consider their own reactions of what's behind them. I mean, in some ways, right, this work, it contains no overt political slogans or content. I mean, it's really only depictions of actual members of the community. And ultimately, unfortunately, the staff and campus police had to take this individual out of the event. And my students later told me that they really felt afraid. And I was really impressed how the artist was able to use both her voice and her images to create an inclusive space and guard that space and consider kind of really, the power of what that work could do. So I'm really thinking about, what is the role of public art and artists in democratic society? How do contemporary street artworks and images of them contribute to public discourse and prompt dialogue? I mean, right now, official public monuments and grassroots street art are in the daily news in our society, and a lot of campuses are questioning what symbols they want to have on their college campuses to represent more democratic and more inclusive values, including removing statues and symbols that represent hate or division. So I'm really wondering how artists' artistic visions are contributing to this contemporary discourse. And I want to talk just a teeny bit about why. So I really starting in about 2017, I started to consider just socially engaged artwork and artists that were using art as a form of activism. I also chose to focus on women or queer identified or those who are working in predominantly female collectives. And I want to say I did this because despite the fact that women are participating in street art to a greater degree than we might have seen like in early graffiti movement, et cetera, we still really, and despite the fact that street art tries to circumvent some of the institutional sexism and elitism, We still know, right, that women constitute a minority. If you look through the global anthologies, you know, they're typically like 10 to 12% of who's featured there. So women remain in the minority. So even if we're talking about things happening in marginalized spaces, it's like who's marginalized even within those set of practices and spaces as well. So it's important to study this as an understudied group. But also by choosing to focus on women, I'm not trying to suggest that gender is the most important or even a recognizable aspect of successful street art. I'm not trying to generalize too broadly or say that, you know, work by women or by queer artists or LGBTQ members is all the same or uniform. Not even a common aesthetic. I mean, we can't tell typically even, right, who the artist is unless we know. But I have recognized that there were some common kinds of themes and artistic strategies that might be worth exploring. And so two kind of bigger themes kind of emerged from the art and artist I was looking at. And one was creating safe and inclusive public space. And the other was reclaiming representations of sexuality. And I don't have time to focus on both today, so I'll really just focus on the first one. But I also recognized that there were some common artistic strategies being put in place. And I showed this work that was done inside and clearly part of a formal, you know, project, but this was true even from what I was seeing, you know, in more guerrilla style or things that were put up informally, you know, in the street. But some common artistic strategies of using aesthetic interventions, use of portraiture, novel depictions of the human form, and the subversion of dominant aesthetics and the male gaze. Okay, so I'm gonna just launch into showing examples from a few different artists that are pretty well known. The first I'll talk about is Swoon. She's born Caledonia Curry, a US American based artist based in New York. And a lot of her street art practice is based in paste ups that are made from detailed portrait drawings and large scale prints that depict members of communities that aren't often recognized or portrayed. And her work definitely fits this theme of kind of showing inclusivity and creating a sense of safety or belonging. And she uses often this type of portraiture to promote beauty, recognition of community, displaying difference with dignity, sometimes depicting what you might call the other with complexity and not kind of a generalizing gaze. Here's another, this is outdoor work. These images also contribute to contemporary political discourses. For example, this one features a large scale nursing mother depicted as, you know, beautiful and loving. It seems like a beautiful image, but despite advances for women and mothers, the right to nurse in public without harassment remains kind of controversial subject in the United States today. So this type of image that she's putting out there is both everyday and also a little bit utopian, because it is not necessarily always a celebrated, you know, type of look. These particular pieces from Beyond the Streets, they depict an older man, also a family, right, that's feeding pigeons. She also demonstrates the use of how placing figures in real or imagined architecture can serve to normalize seeing those figures in certain spaces. And with Swoon in particular, and a couple of our other artists, she will often actually use these same portraits of the same people, but put them in different places and in different contexts. So they come out with very different meanings. And here's one, right? And so works like this really ground the figures in community landscapes and offer a sense of inclusion and belonging to people who are often marginalized or maybe made to feel uncomfortable in those public spaces. Another artist whose work seems to kind of function in a similar way, who's also, I think, pretty internationally known, is Shamsia Hassani. She's from Tehran. Hassani is a lecturer at Kabul University and the first female graffiti artist in Afghanistan. And with news in Afghanistan right now, this is feeling very poignant to me. She uses spray paint and also paint as her main mediums. And on her website, she claims, art changes people's minds and people change the world. It's an image of her working. Hassani's work strives to depict and empower Afghan women and normalize the depictions of women wearing the veil. Her portraits are more stylized than specific, and she also uses what she calls a woman character to offer expression, power, and ambition to Afghan women. The safety and right to exist in public space for Afghan women is still very much in question, and the artist is aware that symbolically her work helps to reclaim public spaces for women. So before I present my final artist, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about these in a theoretical way. How am I explaining what's really going on? And in addition to some of the kind of well-known theoretical perspectives on street art, I found that the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, Russian philosopher and literary theorist, has a lot of explanatory power when we're talking about street art. And some of his well-known concepts like the utterance, polyphony, heteroglossia apply here. They're almost applied very all over the place. But the concept I'm really interested in of his is answerability. And this is this idea of how an artist or someone constructs their message with the idea of how it's going to be taken up on the other side. And understanding, right, that a message is put out purposefully, right, to be a chain and a link of communication, and that you know creates this kind of overall sense of dialogue. And I like this idea because a lot of what we're seeing in this artist's work is the amplification of some aspect of voice or story or visibility or representation within an ethical framework. So this idea of answerability talks to there being kind of an ethical decision-making process as a part of the overall. And I think, you know, a few of these really contemporary books that just came out in the last couple of years all consider, right, these ideas about visual democracy, aesthetic citizenship as really important. And in US context, this has even just been heightened really since the pandemic, right? We've seen more activation of the streets, or more activation also online of work that's, you know, that's political in nature. So another artist I'd like to show here is Tatiana Fazla-Lezada. I'm going to focus specifically on a project she is doing, it's been ongoing since 2012, called Stop Telling Women to Smile. In this work, she you know, interviews women with their experiences of street harassment. She photographs them, creates their portrait, and then will repaste, and this is she has many that are single panels, and I'll show you another here, but oftentimes right then she puts the voice and the image of the woman back out into the street with this very direct gaze in a way to, right, put that kind of voice or idea back, this feminist rhetoric. Women, you know, we don't owe you our time, or say women are not outside for your entertainment. So this is a very specific project that she started and thought would end, but she has been continuing it since that time. And sometimes they're done in very kind of intimate scale, just individuals, and right back in the street from where that information came from. In this case, right, in some cases she makes kind of larger pieces that, you know, that are pasted as well. And this has had enough legs and support for her to do this project in different kind of cultural contexts, also in different languages. This is an image of a version of the project that was done in Mexico City that was called All the Time, Every Day. But another example really of using this socially engaged work, and that is really powerful to put these kind of ideas back into the street. So I just wanted to connect this to a couple of the ideas that I heard in the last few days, you know, in the presentations that I've heard. One thing that's interesting to me is that as these aesthetic interventions, this idea of everyday activism and kind of democratic participation, I have to say that the work doesn't have, the aesthetic intervention, the content doesn't have to be very crazy for it to be a disruption, right? In the cases of almost every aspect I'm telling you today, it's just pictures of actual people, not very idealized, not very stylized, right? But really representing people that are already there. There was also some, you know, talk on the first days about the improvisational nature of street art and the spontaneity that happens within that. And I think even in these projects where there is a planning and there's a forethought and they're going out into the street with something that in a certain way is ready to put up, there's no problem for me of imagining that there's still a lot of spontaneity to the way that happens and to the way the meaning is created. If you believe in this three-part frame of looking for where the meaning is created, there's spontaneity in who finds that, right? And who encounters that work and in what state the work is in when they find it. So I didn't see there was anything kind of antithetical to the idea that even these projects that are very, kind of focused, can really have a spontaneous and improvisational element. I'm really interested also, I think it was Andrea, right, who said that this type of improvisation might lead to what he called, I think, ethical metaphors, or the development of an idea of ethical metaphors. And that related to me what I was trying to say a little bit about this idea of an ethics of answerability, right? Something that, no image will be answerable to all audiences or be embraced by all audiences, but kind of an ethics that's built into the politics and signifying practices of production that then give us a different kind of result. So overall, I hope that just putting out these few artists and some of the work that they're doing, their activist and artivist type work, really shows kind of the overall power of a creative and street-based practice. So here's a few selected references. Let me know if something that I mentioned, is not amongst that. I also wanted to mention that just for this presentation, I kind of cherry-picked images of those artists' work, some of which was not in a street context. Obviously, some was, that was from an actual show in the museum with Beyond the Streets. But the work of all of these artists, they all have a strong street practice and use a very similar aesthetic, and sometimes the exact same work, right, even when they're putting that out into a street context. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Kristin.
So thank you. So see if we have some questions. And I find this very interesting, and also perhaps linking it a little bit to Vittorio's, where you talk about this safe spaces, and also I interviewed, it's almost 20 years ago, I interviewed Lady Pink, the famous graffiti writer, and she talked about how the lack of women among the early graffiti writers in New York was a combination of a kind of larger society structures and subcultural structures that I found. So, but she said that the thing is that especially if you do things illegally, you have to do it at night, and city streets at night are male territory. It's very difficult to move as a woman. And I also think that also perhaps goes to the kind of in the de-industrialized places where Vittorio had been. It's also not probably a place where you want to visit, at least not as a lone woman, especially not doing something that might be illegal. So that's an interesting.
Actually, Jacob, if I can speak to that, one thing I will say is that if I were to talk about the other theme with more about sexuality, Lady Pink is absolutely one of the artists whose work has been out there for a long time, that does that same kind of thing. And, Shamsia Hassani came a few years ago to Los Angeles and had a museum or, a gallery show as well. And she talked about how for her, it felt very safe to go out in Los Angeles at night and, to paint in a space where for, relative to, to Kabul and to Afghanistan, she felt very free. And I think that's still very telling. And then finally, I guess I want to say that there's many reasons that maybe that women do participate a little bit more in street art than we saw in graffiti. And one, though, is potentially about the safety of building an audience and these connections on the internet ahead of time, right? Being able to have some of this work and the things put out there, the connections, so that then when you are in the street context, you have a network as well. So I think that that's beyond the top scope of today, but I think that could be some of the reasoning as well.
Yeah. And something that all of the artists that you focused on were actually making portraits. So that's also interesting. And I think that the interesting thing with the portrait, I think it's Tara West who wrote that the portrait uses all of Peirce's three concepts of the image. It's indexical, symbolical, and iconic at the same time, because there is a likeness. There is a symbol. It relates to different types of social conventions and representations, and it's also always in a certain. It also portrays somebody in a certain place and a certain time, and I thought that was very interesting. Perhaps you would expand on this idea that all of these artists seem to focus on portraiture.
Yeah. Well, and also, even though I'm making some claims about these women, there's globally known street artists, like in particular Shepard Fairey and JR, who absolutely use specific portraiture as a part, of their practice. But it's not lost on me that during the last century, during modernism, that it was women and artists of color who were still working in portraiture when that was not what was happening and not, what was popular or what was there. But one effect of the specificity of the portrait, or even the specificity of the portrait, even if it's placed in different locations, like Swoon will put the same portrait in different locations, is that it pulls the figure back from advertising, right? And if street art is pulling so heavily from the rhetoric of advertising, it absolutely then takes away the nameless, faceless model that uses her sexuality to sell the product, and instead insists on a much more, specificness to the humanity. Many of you know Judy Vaca, the Chicana muralist, and she said, good street art isn't just pretty girls, right? It's not enough, right? To have that, it has to have that deeper meaning. And so I feel like this use of portraiture is a very bold and empowering move. And in some ways we think of the portrait as almost like a throwback, right? Something that's ancient form, and I hadn't thought about that as all using kind of all three types, of the symbol of the image. So that's a great addition. Thank you, Jacob.
Susan has a question or a reflection.
It's not really a question. It's just a follow-up to Jacob's observation, which was great. I mean, portraits of women, large scale, looking beautiful, are a lot of commissioned street art, particularly in the lesser festivals. So it's just really nice to see that kind of reclaimed for activist purposes, Yeah, I really wish we could all go for a beer after this. I want to talk.
Or coffee in Southern California. It's morning here.
Oh, yeah, true. Irish coffee.
Are there any more questions or reflections?
Yeah, I want, first of all, I want to say thank you for the two talks. They were both really interesting. And I want to say that just a reflection about women artists, I was really surprised because I was interviewing this curator who did this really big project in Israel and Jerusalem in the very religious sector. And she said that she had a problem because she wanted to bring women artists too, but she couldn't see how the religious community would react to women painting in public. So what they did is that the male did the whole festival, and then at night when nobody was looking, the women would go and spray paint, so there's like the muralists, which were the men, and then there were the women who they went like graffiti artists straight on, with the hoods and everything in the night, actually wearing like men clothes so they can go and paint. So in the day you could see this, because they were too afraid that if the community itself saw the women painting, they wouldn't react and they will vandalize the works. So and what was amazing that this is not something that came, from the women themselves. It came from the community, the culture itself, and the lack of acceptance of women that, do this kind of things.
Yeah.
And
yeah, thanks for that. And, it's interesting. I understand, and like with Susan's comments, when we're talking about the festivals and the different types, I mean, I think, there are definitely these female focused, festivals as well, in particular things like Femme Fierce, and you can really see the need in a certain way, right, to create a separate space, or, to make it a truly safe and inclusive space, even within the broader, concept of the idea of the festivals being, right, this legal avenue and the place that's, that everything should be happening. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that.
And I wanted to ask actually Vittorio something. Because I had enough time to think about your lecture, now that there was space, I was thinking, how do you see the transition of blue from, let's say, weird to almost mainstream? Because in many aspects, the earlier works were weird, but today, at least in Israel, I can tell you that at least in my city in Haifa, like many artists grew on blue. They imitated when he did them stop motions, they did the stop motions. When he did this themes, they did this themes. And today, and you see, he's become so mainstream that if he goes and erases his works, this gets first in the so, and he references all this classical art, Giotto and Goya and Bosch. So I was wondering, like, for me at least, he moved like away from the weird, and I was wondering if you see it that way or how you see it.
Thank you very much, Einat, for the question. I think that blue has a sort of love and hate relationship with this. I mean, the developments, the late developments of his practice, because I think here. I never had the chance to meet him or interview him because, well, it's very difficult to find him and to meet him. But I think he really enjoys doing these huge murals, very detailed murals, which have become effectively very different from what he used to do before. Which were mostly white with black outlines, figures with no background at all. And now he usually does this whole wall murals, and I really don't know, because I'm sure he hates to be mainstream. But at the same time, every time he does something, it's always very successful and goes always worldwide and mainstream. So I really don't know how to interpret this, because I would like to have his opinion on that before expressing mine. Effectively, in the case of the last judgment, of the atheist last judgment, I think the awareness of the whole thing is the connection that we can do with Giotto and with the iconography of the Last Judgment. But apart of that, I think each time someone sees a blue wall, says, "Wow, it's beautiful." No, it's weird. So it's true. I sense as well this shift from being totally weird when he used to go into abandoned places and do the stop motion wall painted animations. That was completely weird. I mean, I remember the first time I saw Muto in 2008 on the internet. I was like, wow, what is this? It was completely, it was completely weird, because it was something totally unseen at the time. Yes, I think you're right when you say that now he's completely mainstream, but at the same time, I think his intentions are totally others. So
and maybe my own taste is too weird, so I'm moving him into mainstream.
Right, I don't know, but yes, perhaps it's a possibility. Yes.
Yes, thank you for Einat also for the questions, and thank Vittorio and Kristin for your two great presentations. I had a few other things in mind, but I will text you. Just one tip in the Swedish context for Kristin, perhaps to check out the Juntan workshops, which is a workshop, graffiti and street art workshop, who is open for anybody who is a non-cis male. So that are working very activist and very interesting in the Swedish graffiti and street art scene, that I really think is very interesting. Yes, I think we have a break now, right, Pedro?
Yes, we have a 1 hour break actually.
Yeah.
And it's the idea here was to try to think and invite and multiply the invitations so we can gather as much persons as possible for the last panel. Already sent some emails. I'm opening the link in the Facebook. I'm trying to make an happy hour here. So maybe we can expand these invitations and bring as much persons as possible for the final moment. That will be at 5:30. So this was more or less the idea. I think I thank very much the presentations here. Vittorio, I had the opportunity to meet in person Blue in 2010, and he's quite a character actually. He's a very regular person in terms of appearance, and it can be you or me. It's very, but in terms of principles, he's very tight. So he went. You can imagine that going from Italy to Lisbon, from Rome to Lisbon by train, it's kind of hard because there's a not good connection between Madrid and Lisbon. But he went and he stick to his principles that he doesn't go by plane anywhere, and it's a quite impressive character. And then he proved along these past years that he's on his principles altogether. So yeah, but yes, it's challenging because even these kind of personalities in the end shape our notion of wordness, you know. And what's awkward, passing some years, it became more normalized. You can see it on jazz music, for instance. It's quite normalized, but in the beginning it was quite a strange thing, right? So, but yeah, okay. Thank you. I will leave the room open, let's say, and if anyone wants to share or maintain dialogue, they are welcome. I just will stop recording and stuff and sharing live, and I will try to reach as much persons as possible so we can meet here at 5:30. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
So
again,
thank you all. See you soon.
And Pedro.
Bye. See you soon.